The fluorescent lights of the Edwards Air Force Base briefing room hummed with an almost accusatory tone as Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention before the assembled officers. The morning sun filtered through the tall military-grade windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak table where at least 30 pilots sat, their leather jackets worn smooth from years of service. Sarah's own jacket hung perfectly on her broad shoulders, new enough to still carry that particular leather smell that marked fresh accomplishment, yet worn enough at the edges to speak of legitimate hours in the cockpit. She'd earned every single one of those miles in the sky the hard way. Her commanding officer, General Marcus Williams, a gray-haired veteran with a chest full of medals and a voice that could shake stone, stood before the assembly with what Sarah recognized as barely concealed amusement. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who'd seen 3 wars and 3 presidents. But today, his expression suggested he was about to say something he found absolutely hilarious. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice filling the room with that particular military authority that made everyone sit straighter. "Today, we're conducting an official call sign ceremony. As you know, call signs in this squadron aren't given lightly. They're earned through demonstrated excellence, exceptional performance, and qualities that define a pilot's character." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the room. "This particular call sign has been earned by someone who has logged over 2,400 flight hours, completed 2 combat deployments to hostile territories, and maintains perfect maintenance records with our aircraft." Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly. This was it. After 6 months of extraordinary performances, after the grueling selection process that had seen her outfly pilots with 15 years of experience, this was the moment. Call signs were sacred in aviation culture. They were identity markers, badges of honor, proof that you belonged. "With all that being said," General Williams continued, his eyes now fixed directly on her, "I present the call sign Falcon." For a microsecond there was silence, the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche. Then it started with a small sound from the back of the room, a chuckle, then another. Within seconds, the entire briefing room had erupted into laughter, not congratulatory laughter, not the respectful kind. This was the laughter of men who just heard a joke at someone else's expense. Sarah's jaw clenched. She could feel the heat rising in her neck, but she maintained her expression, neutral, professional, unreadable. This was a test. This was always a test. Colonel James Thompson, a 30-year veteran with silver at his temples and a reputation for being the best stick-and-rudder pilot on the base, leaned back in his chair with a broad smile spreading across his weathered face. He was the unofficial alpha of this group, the one whose opinion shaped the culture of the squadron. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of authority earned through decades of flying. "Falcon," he let the word hang in the air, stretching it out like taffy. His eyes moved from General Williams to Sarah, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Look at her, more like canary." His voice dripped with mock sympathy. "Sweet, small, pretty, a canary." The room exploded again. Some pilots actually slapped the table with their palms, wheezing with laughter. A younger lieutenant in the 3rd row actually had to wipe tears from his eyes. Sarah watched it all with a sensation like her chest was being compressed in a vice. She'd known this might happen. She'd prepared for this response. But preparation and reality were vastly different things. What made it worse wasn't the mockery itself. It was that the laughter came from men she'd flown alongside, men she'd trusted, men whose opinions carried weight in a community she desperately wanted to be part of. There was Thompson, who'd nodded at her during her first week, making her think they'd formed some kind of understanding. There was Captain Rodriguez, who'd even bought her coffee once in the officers' club. There was the entire contingent of younger pilots she'd mentored, shown new techniques to, helped through difficult landings. All of them were laughing. Sarah's fists clenched beneath the conference table, her fingernails creating small crescents in her palms. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand respect. She wanted to ask them how many of them had flown combat missions with less than 300 hours of experience. She wanted to remind them that her landing record was better than 90% of the pilots in this room. She wanted to tell them that being a woman didn't diminish her qualifications. It enhanced them because she'd had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But she said nothing. General Williams raised his hand and the laughter slowly died down. He looked disappointed. Sarah could see it in the set of his jaw. He tried to make this moment authentic, to present her achievement as genuine, and his own officers had undermined him. But his voice remained steady. "The call sign, Falcon, is hereby official," he announced. "Captain Mitchell has earned the respect of this squadron through exceptional flying and undeniable courage. I expect all personnel to honor this designation." The words were right, but they fell flat. The damage was done. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her, some curious, some amused, many indifferent. Thompson had already shifted his attention to someone else, making some joke to the captain next to him. The moment had passed. As the briefing continued, Sarah's mind drifted. Outside the window, she could see the flight line where the F-16 sat like sleeping predators, their fuselages gleaming in the California sun. Those aircraft didn't care about gender. They didn't care about laughter or mockery. They responded to skill, to precision, to the marriage of human will and mechanical power. That's where she truly belonged. She thought about her father, a mechanic who'd spent his entire life in the service industry. She thought about her mother, a nurse who'd worked double shifts to pay for Sarah's flying lessons as a kid. She thought about every teacher who told her girls weren't naturally good at math, every guidance counselor who'd suggested she consider more practical career paths, every relative at family gatherings who'd expressed doubt about her flying dreams. And now she thought about these pilots, these men who'd been given their positions by circumstance and time, not by fighting for every inch of ground. Sarah's fists unclenched slowly. Her breathing became measured again. She looked out the window at her Falcon, waiting there on the tarmac. The mockery had begun. But it wouldn't last. She would make sure of that. 3 weeks, 21 days, 504 hours of deliberate, obsessive, punishing training. That's what it took for Sarah to transform her anger into something more dangerous, cold, calculated determination. The first week after the call sign ceremony was the hardest emotionally. Sarah had driven home that afternoon, sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment complex for 40 minutes, and allowed herself exactly 15 minutes to cry. Not because she was weak, not because she couldn't handle the disrespect, but because she needed to acknowledge the hurt before she could weaponize it. She'd been 17 when she first started flying lessons, saving money from working at a grocery store, washing cars on weekends, taking every odd job she could find. Her parents had sacrificed enormously, her mother working night shifts at the hospital, her father taking on extra mechanical jobs that left his hands permanently stained with grease. Every hour in that Cessna 172 had been purchased with their sweat and her determination. And now, 3 decades of aviation, culture wanted to reduce her accomplishment to a joke about songbirds. By day 2 of her self-imposed training regime, Sarah had transformed her 1-bedroom apartment into something resembling a pilot's war room. Charts covered the walls, weather patterns, altitude conversion tables, fuel calculations, aerodynamic formulas. Her kitchen table disappeared under stacks of technical manuals, each one annotated with handwritten notes in the margins. She'd purchased a used flight simulator for home, spending $3,000 she'd been saving for a car down payment. The simulator sat in her living room like a mechanical throne, and she would strap into it for 3 hours at a time, running scenarios that pushed her to the edge of her abilities. Her typical day began at 4:47 a.m., not 5:00, because the specific time felt more disciplined somehow. She'd wake before her alarm, her mind already working on problems from the previous day's flights. Coffee would brew while she did an hour of physical training, running on her apartment complex's track, strength conditioning in the gym, core work that left her muscles screaming. Aviation required more than flying skill. It required a body that could withstand G-forces, that could maintain focus despite physical stress, that could perform under the ultimate pressure of fatigue. By 7:00 a.m., she'd be at the base, going through aircraft pre-flight checks with meticulous care. And this is where the real pressure began. On day 3, she was scheduled to fly a standard training route with Captain Marcus Denver, a mid-level pilot with 8 years of experience. The mission was routine, nothing complicated, just altitude transitions and navigation exercises. Sarah executed every maneuver with precision. Her turns were within 3 degrees of perfect. Her altitude holds were within 50 feet of target. Her landing was textbook. When she climbed from the cockpit, Denver was waiting with a frown that had nothing to do with her performance. "You're flying like you're afraid of the aircraft," he said, not bothering with any greeting. "All that precision is fine for a simulator, but real flying needs instinct. Feel. You're thinking too much." Sarah felt the rage bubble up, hot and sharp, but she'd prepared for this. She'd known they would move the goalposts, change the rules, find new ways to dismiss her. "Understood," she said evenly. "I'll adjust." The next flight she flew with more aggressive inputs, more intuitive maneuvering, perfect performance again. Denver couldn't find fault with the flying itself, so instead he questioned her decision-making. "Why'd you choose that descent angle instead of a shallower approach?" The wind shear data suggested a steeper angle would minimize fuel expenditure while maintaining safety margins. "Maybe so, but you didn't check with your wingman. Leadership means consulting your team." She hadn't realized there were rules being applied to her that didn't apply to anyone else. When Thompson flew aggressively without consulting his wingman, it was called confidence. When Sarah did the same, it was called arrogance. By the second week, Sarah had figured out the game. There were no rules that could be fairly applied. Every standard would shift based on the outcome they wanted. So she stopped trying to win by their metrics. She started keeping detailed records of every flight, altitude data, G-force readings, fuel consumption, landing precision. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers couldn't be argued with. She began requesting flights with different pilots, rotating through the squadron systematically. Every single one of them expected to find fault with her performance, and every single one was forced to confront the reality that her flying was flawless. More than flawless, it was exceptional. Thompson seemed to understand what she was doing. On day 12, after watching her complete a series of maneuvers that even he couldn't criticize, he approached her in the hangar with that perpetual smirk. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low enough that others couldn't hear. "Flying perfect, keeping records, trying to shame us into accepting you." Sarah met his eyes directly. "I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm trying to fly the best I can." "Yeah, well, you're making the rest of us look bad, and that's not going to win you friends." "I didn't come here to make friends," Sarah replied, her voice steady as steel. "I came here to be a good pilot." Something flickered in Thompson's expression, not respect exactly, but recognition. She'd drawn a line. She wasn't here for their approval or their camaraderie. She was here to prove something to herself. The third week was different. Sarah didn't stop training, but her mindset shifted. Instead of trying to prove something to the men in the squadron, she was proving something to herself. Every flight became a meditation. Every maneuver became a conversation between her and the aircraft, a dialogue that had existed since she first felt the controls respond to her input as a 17-year-old in a rented Cessna. Her apartment at night became her sanctuary. The flight simulator would run until midnight. She'd study weather patterns, memorize emergency procedures that went beyond what was required, learn the mechanical specifications of the F-16 so intimately that she could diagnose problems by touch and sound alone. Her mother called one evening and found her awake at 2 a.m., reviewing hydraulic system diagrams. "Sarah, baby, you need to sleep," her mother said, concern evident even through the phone line. "I will," Sarah promised. I'm almost there, Mom. I can feel it. I'm almost at the place where they can't dismiss me anymore." The truth was more complicated. She would never be at a place where they couldn't dismiss her. She knew that now. But she could reach a place where their dismissal was irrelevant, where her performance spoke so loudly that their laughter became background noise. By day 21, something had shifted inside her. The anger hadn't disappeared. It still burned, a pilot light that would always be there, driving her forward. But it had been transformed into something more sustainable. Purpose. Cold, clear purpose. She'd flown 47 hours in those 3 weeks, logged detailed notes on every single flight, maintained a physical training regimen that would break most people, sacrificed sleep, social time, relationships, and comfort for one simple goal: to be so undeniably good that they would have no choice but to accept her. That evening, sitting in the darkness of her apartment with the simulator controllers still in her hands, Sarah looked at herself in the reflection of her computer screen. Her eyes were tired but clear. Her face was leaner from the stress and lost meals. Her hands were steady. She was ready. And soon everyone else would be forced to realize it too. Sarah woke at 4:47 a.m. on Tuesday, as she had every morning for the past 3 weeks, but today felt different. Not in her body, that was trained to the point of automatic response, but in her mind. Today was the test, the actual test. She knew this from the briefing memo she'd received late Monday afternoon. A critical training exercise classified as Level 5, the highest simulation protocol available. 4 aircraft, 2 hours, maximum operational parameters. And Thompson had been selected as her wingman. Not by accident. Never by accident. The weather outside her apartment was perfect. That deceptive California perfection that made dangerous situations seem benign. Clear skies, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. Good flying weather. The kind of conditions that offered no excuses, no extenuating circumstances, just skill against expectation. Sarah went through her morning routine like a ritual. The shower was cold, shocking her awake, pushing her nervous system into high alert. She dressed in her flight suit, feeling the familiar weight of it, the zippers catching slightly as they always did, the name tag MITCHELL stitched in black letters. She'd sewn it herself at midnight 3 weeks ago, the needle shaking in her hands then but steady now. Breakfast was a protein bar consumed in her car during the 20-minute drive to Edwards Air Force Base. The roads were empty at 5:30 a.m., nothing but street lights and the occasional truck hauling goods across the desert. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel at 10:02, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She ran through the mission parameters mentally. Altitude ceiling 28,500 feet, airspace boundaries within the designated training corridor, weather contingency protocols if conditions deteriorated, fuel conservation requirements, communication protocols. The data was old friends by now. She'd memorized it 3 weeks ago and then practiced with it every single day since. She could fly this mission in her sleep, but she wouldn't be sleeping. She would be absolutely present, absolutely focused, absolutely perfect. The guard at the base entrance waved her through with a nod. She'd become a fixture here, arriving earlier and leaving later than anyone else. The security detail knew her car, knew her routine, knew that Captain Mitchell was the one who drove with military precision and parked in the same spot every single day. The flight line came into view as she crested the rise past the administration buildings. The F-16s were lined up like sleeping raptors, their curved fuselages catching the first hints of pre-dawn light. Her aircraft was the third one from the left, the one she'd flown for the past week and a half. She'd logged 19 hours in this specific machine. She knew its personality, its quirks, The way the left engine sometimes hesitated for a fraction of a second on cold mornings before settling into its rhythm. She knew how the landing gear mechanism creaked in a particular way when she engaged it. She knew that the oxygen system had a microscopic leak that would eventually need attention. This aircraft was almost an extension of herself now. Sarah parked her car and walked across the tarmac. The air was cool, still carrying the desert chill of pre-dawn. Her flight boots made precise sounds on the concrete, click, 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 a rhythmic meditation. Other ground crews were arriving now, mechanics and fuel specialists and equipment officers, all moving with the practiced efficiency of military personnel. Nobody greeted her. Nobody had greeted her much in the past 3 weeks. Her presence was now simply accepted as part of the landscape. At 6:15 a.m. she arrived at the flight equipment room. The gear specialist, a quiet man named Rodriguez who'd been supportive from day one, had her parachute and helmet already laid out. He didn't say anything. They'd moved past the need for conversation. He simply helped her into the gear with practiced efficiency, checking every strap, every clasp, making sure nothing was loose or incorrectly fastened. The helmet felt like a crown. The moment it was secured, Sarah felt the shift happen inside her. The part of her that was Sarah Mitchell, a woman who'd spent 3 weeks being mocked and second-guessed, disappeared. In her place came something else. Something that had no gender, no insecurity, no doubt. Just pure pilot instinct and training. By 6:45 a.m., the pre-flight briefing commenced in the flight operations room. The 4 pilots who would be flying today gathered around the mission board. Thompson was there, his usual smirk in place. Captain Denver was flying as number 3, and a younger pilot named Harrison was flying number 4. All of them had flown together before. All of them except Sarah had been accepted as part of the squadron for years. General Williams ran through the mission parameters with mechanical efficiency. Altitude gates, airspace boundaries, communication protocols, emergency procedures, fuel conservation requirements. It was all routine. It was all exactly what Sarah had prepared for. When Williams finished the briefing, Thompson stood and stretched, his leather jacket creaking. He looked directly at Sarah with that infuriating expression, not quite a smile but close enough. "Ready to fly, Songbird?" he asked, and some of the younger pilots chuckled softly. This was the moment where Sarah could have reacted, could have said something sharp, could have defended herself, could have shown the anger that had been simmering for 3 weeks. Instead, she said nothing. She simply met his eyes, and in that silence something shifted. Thompson's expression flickered, just for a second, with something that might have been doubt. Sarah gathered her flight bag and walked toward the flight line without another word. The walk to her aircraft seemed to take forever and no time at all. The sun was rising now, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The F-16 waited for her at the edge of the concrete, its canopy glinting in the new light. Sarah approached it like she was approaching a lover she hadn't seen in years, with reverence and recognition and absolute certainty. She began her pre-flight inspection at 7:00 a.m., moving through each checkpoint with methodical precision. She touched every component, checked every connection, verified every system. The aircraft responded to her touch, not in any mystical way, but in the tangible way that an aircraft does when you understand its language. This machine knew her. She knew it. They would fly together today. By 7:23 a.m., she was in the cockpit, strapping herself into the seat that had become her second home. The canopy closed with a hydraulic hiss that felt like the closing of a door to a new world. Around her, the instrumentation glowed to life, needles settling into their rest positions, screens flickering with data, systems performing their startup sequences. Sarah took a long breath and put her hand on the throttle. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. "Falcon 1 to control," she transmitted, her voice steady and clear. "Requesting engine start clearance." "Cleared to start," control responded immediately. The right engine engaged with a roar that thrummed through her body. Then the left, both engines building to their familiar idle. The aircraft trembled slightly, like a runner preparing for a race. Sarah looked out at the desert stretching toward the horizon, at the other 3 aircraft being crewed by pilots who still doubted her, at the sky waiting above. She was ready. She was finally, completely, absolutely ready. The first 45 minutes of flight were transcendent. Sarah had led her 3 aircraft formation away from Edwards Air Force Base at 7:32 a.m., climbing steadily into the crystalline California morning. The ascent was smooth, controlled, perfect. Behind her wingman position, Thompson followed in Eagle 2, his aircraft maintaining ideal separation distance. Denver and Harrison trailed in formation, their F-16s cutting through the thin air like sharks moving through water. The view from 25,000 feet was the view Sarah had fallen in love with when she was 17. The desert spread beneath them in shades of gold and brown, mountains rising like sleeping giants on the horizon, the curvature of the earth becoming almost visible at this altitude. The sky above was deep blue, not the pale blue of ground level, but the rich, saturated blue that only existed at extreme altitude. It was the blue of another world. Sarah's hands were relaxed on the controls. The F-16 flew with the responsiveness of a living thing, each input translating immediately into movement. She adjusted altitude by increments measured in tens of feet. She guided the aircraft through gentle banking turns that felt like they were dancing rather than maneuvering. This was why she flew. This exact moment. This feeling of absolute unity between pilot and machine. At 27,500 feet, she initiated the first of the planned maneuvers, a controlled climb to the altitude ceiling of 28,500 feet. The right engine's performance was nominal, according to all instruments. Fuel consumption was optimal. Temperature readings were exactly where they should be. Everything was working perfectly. Which is why what happened next made no sense. The first indication was a subtle vibration. Not alarming, not immediately noticeable to someone who wasn't intimately attuned to the aircraft's signature frequencies. But Sarah had logged 19 hours in this specific F-16. She knew the exact vibration pattern of normal operation. This wasn't it. The vibration increased over the course of 3 seconds. It went from subtle to pronounced, from interesting to concerning. Sarah's eyes flicked across the instrument panel, searching for the source. Everything still red-green, all systems nominal, all engines functioning properly. Then the right engine began to make a sound. It started as a high-pitched whine that Sarah felt through the seat beneath her. The frequency increased, a sound like a jet turbine being slowly tortured, rising in pitch and intensity. In her headset, her own breathing suddenly seemed very loud. Eagle 1 requests status, Thompson's voice came through the radio. He'd felt it too. The vibration was building, radiating through the formation. He knew something was wrong. Sarah didn't have time to respond. The vibration became violent. The aircraft lurched, not dramatically but with an unmistakable violence that was completely wrong. Sarah's training kicked in instantly, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision even as her mind was still processing what was happening. Then the explosion happened. It wasn't a massive detonation, not the kind of catastrophic failure that would instantly tear the aircraft apart. Instead, it was something worse in some ways, a contained violence, a controlled devastation. The right engine seized completely and then began to catastrophically fail, internal components disintegrating at high speed, the turbine blades fragmenting and tearing through the engine housing. The vibration became a violent shaking that threw Sarah's head back against the seat. Alarms began screaming through the cockpit, a cacophony of electronic voices demanding attention. The engine fire warning lit up like a burning coal. Hydraulic pressure indicators on the right side began falling. The aircraft banked hard to the right, fighting Sarah's attempts to correct it, pulling away from her input like it wanted to dive toward the earth below. Sarah's training had prepared her for engine failure. She'd practiced it hundreds of times in simulators. She'd studied emergency procedures until they were burned into her nervous system. But simulation couldn't prepare you for the raw physical terror of 2 tons of aircraft trying to kill you. Her hands moved with automatic precision. She killed fuel flow to the right engine. She activated the fire suppression system. She engaged the left engine to maximum thrust, fighting the asymmetrical thrust that was trying to roll the aircraft. Through the violent shaking, through the screaming alarms, through the adrenaline flooding her system like ice water, Sarah's training held. The aircraft stabilized slightly, still descending faster than it should, but no longer in an uncontrolled dive. "Mayday, mayday," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Years of training, years of discipline, years of refusing to show fear in front of men who were waiting for her to break, all of it converged in that single moment. Falcon 1 engine catastrophic failure. Right engine destroyed. Hydraulic pressure critical. Request immediate descent clearance. Control's response was instantaneous but strained. "Falcon 1, we see you on scope. Stand by for assistance." Sarah wasn't waiting. The aircraft was still descending too rapidly. At 27,500 feet with one functional engine and multiple system failures, she had perhaps 3 or 4 minutes before she reached an altitude from which ejection became untenable. The training scenario parameters said she should eject immediately. The rules said abandonment was the proper response to this level of catastrophe. But Sarah had never been good at following rules that didn't make sense. She pulled back on the stick gently, fighting the aircraft's desire to dive, trying to arrest the descent. The left engine was screaming, straining under the full load of keeping a 32,000-pound aircraft aloft. The temperature gauge for that engine was climbing into the yellow, approaching the red zone. If it overheated, if it failed too, she would have nothing. She would be a passenger on a falling brick. Behind her in the formation, she heard Thompson's voice, tight with tension. "Falcon 1, eject. Eject now. We've got you on scope. Rescue teams are already moving." The ocean was coming closer. The altitude reading showed 26,800 feet, still too high for a safe water ejection. The survival rates for overwater ejections in hostile territory were poor. SAR recovery would take time, and in a combat training scenario, hostile elements could be moving toward her position. "Negative ejection," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. Every instrument was screaming at her. Every system was failing. The aircraft was trying to kill her with everything it had. But Sarah had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Not literally this engine failure, but this exact combination of pressure and consequence and stakes. "Eagle 2, negative ejection required," she transmitted. "I have her. All personnel prepare emergency landing protocols at base. I'm coming home." The radio went silent. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, complete silence. Then Thompson's voice came back, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was no mockery in it. There was only shock and something that might have been respect. "Copy that, Falcon 1. All units standing by for emergency landing. You're cleared for direct approach." Sarah cut her transmission and focused entirely on the aircraft. The world had compressed down to the instruments in front of her, the stick in her hands, the rudder pedals under her feet. 26,200 feet, still descending too fast. The left engine was redlining, the temperatures climbing toward critical. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her mind working through calculations and compensations and emergency procedures at lightning speed. The desert floor was coming up to meet her. The runway at Edwards Air Force Base was visible in the distance, its concrete strip looking impossibly small from this altitude and descent angle. Sarah had never felt more afraid in her entire life. And she had never felt more alive. The silence after Sarah's transmission lasted only seconds, but it felt like eternity compressed into the space between heartbeats. In that silence, she could hear her own breathing, fast, controlled, but audible even through the roar of the straining left engine and the cacophony of alarms. Thompson's voice came back, and it was different now. Gone was the casual mockery, the superior drawl, the undertone of dismissal. His voice crackled with raw emotion, concern, fear, something that might have been dawning respect. Falcon 1, Eagle 2, that's affirmative, we're standing by. All emergency personnel are moving to stations. But Sarah barely heard him. Her entire consciousness had compressed into the immediate moment. The instruments in front of her, the stick in her hands, the aircraft that was trying very hard to kill her. The altitude was 25,900 feet and falling. The descent rate was still too steep, 200 feet per minute. At this rate, she'd reach the ground in roughly 12 minutes. But the problem wasn't just the descent rate. The problem was that she was trying to maintain altitude with an engine that was already screaming, already pushed beyond its design parameters, already threatening to fail completely. Sarah pulled back on the stick incrementally, careful not to overdo it. One of the things her extensive training had taught her was that panic manifested as overcompensation. A frightened pilot would yank the stick, would push the throttle too hard, would overstress the remaining systems trying to save themselves. Those pilots would fail. Sarah was determined not to be a cautionary tale. The left engine temperature was climbing, 845 degrees Celsius, still within operational parameters but climbing. For every 1,000 feet of altitude she lost, the engine had to work harder. For every harder turn she made, the stress increased. She was in a vicious cycle, and she knew it. The desert floor was becoming clearer below, individual terrain features now visible, the distant mountains no longer abstract but concrete landmarks. Too concrete, too close. "Control, this is Falcon 1, she transmitted, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged animal. "Request vectors to nearest suitable landing area. Edwards still preferred, but confirm options." "Falcon 1, Edwards is 18 miles bearing 270. That's your best option. Runway 15 is available full length. All emergency equipment is staging." 18 miles. At her current descent rate and speed, she had maybe 15 minutes to cover that distance and establish a landing approach. It was possible. It was theoretically achievable, but only if nothing else failed. Only if the left engine held. Only if she could maintain enough control of the aircraft to navigate, descend, and align with the runway. In other words, only if she didn't make any mistakes. Sarah's hands were beginning to cramp from tension. She consciously relaxed her grip slightly, aware that tension translated to jerky inputs, and jerky inputs meant wasting fuel and putting unnecessary stress on an engine that was already on the edge of catastrophic failure. This was the paradox of high-stress flying. You had to relax while you were terrified. You had to breathe deeply while your body was screaming at you to hyperventilate. You had to think clearly while your amygdala was flooding your system with fight-or-flight chemicals. She trained for this, but training and reality were miles apart. Denver's voice came through the radio, tense and professional. "Falcon 1, Eagle 3, we're maintaining visual contact. You're holding altitude better. Hydraulics still critical." Sarah glanced at the hydraulic pressure gauge, still falling but slower now. "Affirmative," she confirmed. "Pressure at 40%, rate of loss decreasing." What she didn't say was that at 40% hydraulic pressure, she was flying on a knife's edge. The aircraft needed hydraulic pressure to move the control surfaces. Without it, she was essentially trying to operate a commercial jetliner with the controls half disconnected. Every input required more physical effort. Every correction meant digging deeper into the reserves of an engine that was running on fumes. Thompson's voice came back, this time with something that sounded almost like urgency mixed with concern. "Falcon 1, we can vector down ahead of you. Provide chase. Make sure you make it to Edwards." It was an offer of support, a moment of genuine concern from a man who'd spent weeks mocking her. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. In this moment, With death a concrete possibility, Thompson was offering to treat her like a fellow pilot rather than an interloper. "Eagle 2, maintain current position," she responded. "I've got her, maintaining control." "Roger that, Falcon 1." The aircraft shuddered as she adjusted the rudder trim to compensate for the asymmetrical thrust. The left engine was now at 860 degrees, getting close to the red zone. Sarah did the math in her head, running calculations that had nothing to do with the aircraft's systems and everything to do with her own survival. If the left engine failed before she reached the runway, she was dead. Simple as that. A single-engine F-16 at low altitude, with compromised hydraulics and in a descent pattern, didn't have options. Ejection would be a possibility, but the probability of successful recovery from a water ejection in this scenario was less than 30%. She was essentially betting her life on an engine holding together long enough for her to reach concrete. 24,000 feet. The runway at Edwards was still 18 miles away. At her current ground speed, roughly 7 minutes at minimum, she needed to descend maybe another 23,500 feet in that time. It was possible. Barely. Sarah adjusted her descent angle, trying to find the sweet spot between getting down fast enough to reach the runway and not pushing the left engine beyond its limits. It was like threading a needle while flying an aircraft that was actively trying to kill you. Her breathing had settled into a steady rhythm. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The meditation of extreme focus. Her eyes moved across the instruments with practiced precision, reading the story they told. Altitude, airspeed, descent rate, engine temperature, hydraulic pressure, heading. The data painted a picture of an aircraft and pilot locked in a partnership that was both beautiful and terrible. "Falcon 1, you're looking good on approach vectors," Control confirmed. "Continue present descent. You're clear all the way to Edwards." Clear, that was a nice word. It meant no other traffic, no conflicts, nothing to worry about except the failing aircraft and the dying engine, and the impossible task of getting all 32,000 pounds to the ground intact. Sarah could see Edwards now in the distance, a small geometric shape on the desert floor, the runway a thin gray line cutting through the brown landscape. Somewhere down there, emergency vehicles were positioning themselves. Somewhere down there, every pilot at the base was watching the radar blip that represented her, probably betting on whether she'd make it or not. She thought about Thompson's face in the briefing room. She thought about the laughter. She thought about 3 weeks of training that had brought her to this exact moment. The left engine temperature hit 875 degrees. Sarah adjusted the throttle back just slightly, willing the engine to hold just a little longer. Just a little longer. Just until she was home. The moment between acknowledging the problem and solving it is where pilots are born. Sarah had crossed that threshold. Now she was flying not just with her training, but with something deeper, something that transcended conscious thought and became pure instinct married to technical mastery. 23,000 feet. The runway at Edwards was growing clearer. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles now, small shapes arranged in deliberate patterns along the tarmac. The fire trucks were positioned at intervals. The ambulances were standing by. Somewhere in the control tower, people were watching a radar blip descend toward them, probably making bets about whether this would end in miracle or tragedy. Sarah began her approach calculation. The aircraft's ground speed was roughly 320 knots. The runway was 11 miles away now. At her current descent rate of 1,800 feet per minute, she would need to balance several competing demands. Getting down fast enough to reach the runway, but not so fast that the remaining engine couldn't handle the load, not so steep that the damaged hydraulic system couldn't maintain control. She began banking the aircraft to the left, initiating the long turn toward the landing pattern. This was where precision became critical. A shallow bank would buy her more distance and more time for the engine to hold. Too shallow, though, and she wouldn't have time to set up the final approach. It was arithmetic with her life as the variable. The left engine temperature was at 878 degrees now. The vibration through the aircraft had settled into a kind of rhythm, still concerning, but at least it was predictable. Sarah had learned in her weeks of obsessive training that predictable problems could be managed. It was the unexpected that killed you. Falcon 1, you're established on approach vector, control confirmed. Continue descent, you're clear to the runway. Sarah acknowledged the transmission with a simple Roger, then focused entirely on the flying. Her hands made minute adjustments to the stick and rudder, guiding the aircraft through a turn that had to be precisely calibrated. Too aggressive, and she'd stress the engine beyond recovery. Too gentle, and she'd overshoot the runway alignment. The bank angle was 23 degrees. Perfect. The descent rate was stable at 1,600 feet per minute. Better. The ground was becoming increasingly detailed, individual buildings, parked aircraft, the geometry of the runway threshold markers. Sarah's breathing remained steady. Her vision had narrowed to a kind of tunnel focus, where only the instruments and the runway existed. The rest of the world, the concerned voices on the radio, the emergency personnel waiting below, the other pilots in formation above her, all of it faded into background noise. She was alone with the aircraft now. Just her and this machine, locked in a conversation written in flight dynamics and hydraulic pressure, and the desperate will of a pilot who absolutely refused to fail. 20,000 feet. The descent was going exactly as planned. The aircraft was holding altitude better now that she'd reduced the bank angle. The aerodynamic forces had shifted, and the remaining engine wasn't having to work quite as hard to maintain lift. But ahead of her, Sarah could see the complication she'd been dreading, the thermal layer that had been building over the desert all morning. As the sun climbed higher, heat radiating from the ground was creating rising air currents, thermals that could lift an aircraft or, in her case, provide unexpected resistance to her carefully calculated descent. Sarah saw it first as a slight shimmer in the air about 5 miles ahead of the runway. Then the aircraft's instruments confirmed it, altimeter showing slightly less descent than expected, airspeed fluctuating by 15 knots. The thermal layer. Most pilots would have cursed. Sarah simply adjusted. She decreased the throttle by another 0.5%, not enough to risk stalling, but enough to allow the aircraft to descend through the thermal rather than fight it. The key was finesse, the lightest possible touch. She was flying the aircraft now rather than commanding it, coaxing it along the descent path like a sailor reading the ocean. The engine temperature held steady at 879 degrees, stable, for now. Thompson's voice came through the radio again, this time with something that sounded like awe. "Falcon 1, you're tracking like a dream down there. Landing mechanics are ready." Sarah didn't respond. Conversation would distract her. She was in the zone now, that place pilots talked about in hushed tones where the aircraft became an extension of thought, where every input and output existed in perfect harmony. She'd touched this state before, usually for brief moments. Now she was living in it, breathing it, becoming it. 15,000 feet. The runway was absolutely clear now. She could see the runway numbers painted on the concrete, the centerline stripe, the touchdown zone. The emergency vehicles had stopped their movement and were now stationary ready. The control tower was dark against the bright desert sky. Sarah initiated a slight right bank to align with the runway centerline. The movement was so gentle it was almost imperceptible, but it was exactly right. The aircraft's nose came around slowly, tracking true toward the concrete strip. The hydraulic pressure gauge was fluctuating now, down to 35%. Sarah watched the number with a part of her consciousness, aware that she was approaching a threshold. Below 30%, control would become noticeably sluggish. Below 20%, the aircraft would be nearly unmaneuverable. She had maybe another 2 minutes before that became critical. 2 minutes to descend from 15,000 feet to touchdown. The math was tight. very tight. But then Sarah realized something that made her smile, a real smile, not a grimace of tension but genuine appreciation for the terrible beauty of the situation. She had approximately the same amount of time left as she had fuel for. The aircraft would land or it would run out of fuel trying. There was no margin, no backup, no second chances. It was perfect. 10,000 feet. The runway threshold was visible now in minute detail. Sarah could see the paint on the ground, the slight imperfections in the concrete, the emergency vehicles lined up like sentries waiting for a visiting dignitary. She began the final descent angle adjustment, dropping the nose slightly to aim for a landing point about 2,000 feet down the runway. That would give her plenty of room to land and brake without using full runway length. The calculation was automatic now, the numbers flowing through her consciousness without requiring conscious thought. The left engine temperature spiked suddenly to 885 degrees, the highest yet. For a moment, Sarah's perfect focus wavered. Then she consciously relaxed her grip on the throttle, adjusted the fuel mixture slightly, and watched as the temperature started to drop back. It was like holding a conversation with the engine itself. 5,000 feet. The runway was enormous now, filling her forward vision. Sarah could see individual emergency personnel now, small figures in yellow and red gear standing beside the vehicles. Falcon 1, you're looking perfect, control transmitted. Cleared to land, wind calm, no cross traffic. Perfect? That was the word they kept using. And in the chaos and desperation and impossible demands of this descent, Sarah had somehow created perfection anyway. She was going to make it. Not because of luck or divine intervention, but because she trained so hard and so deliberately that even in the worst possible circumstances, even with an engine failing and hydraulics failing, and every system screaming in protest, her muscle memory and her will and her absolute refusal to quit had created a path to survival. 3,000 feet. She could hear the landing gear warning, a soft reminder that she needed to extend the landing gear soon, but not yet, not until she was certain. The aircraft was descending through the thermals now, the turbulence gentle but present. Sarah rode it like a surfer on a wave, never fighting, always adjusting, always flowing with the physics of the moment. 2,500 feet. Time to commit. Sarah reached down and pulled the landing gear lever. The familiar mechanical sounds echoed through the cockpit, hydraulic actuators engaging, the gear doors opening, the landing gear extending down and locking into place. The drag increased slightly, confirming the gear was down and locked. She was committed now. There was no going back. Only forward into landing, into survival, into the moment that would change everything. 1,000 feet. The runway filled Sarah's entire vision now. She could see the individual markings, the slight wear patterns on the concrete from thousands of landings, the emergency vehicles holding their positions like sentries at a funeral. Her descent rate was perfect, 700 feet per minute, steady and controlled. The aircraft was configured for landing. Gear down, landing flaps partially deployed, the left engine holding steady at 881 degrees. Everything was in its proper place. Everything was ready. Sarah's hands were absolutely still on the controls now. No movements, no corrections, just steady pressure maintaining the aircraft's trajectory toward the runway threshold. Her breathing had slowed to match her heartbeat, both perfectly calm despite the fact that in less than 2 minutes, she would either land this aircraft successfully or become a casualty statistic. Falcon 1, you're looking beautiful, control transmitted. Continue descent, you're cleared to land. Sarah didn't respond. Her focus was absolute. The runway was beneath her now, the threshold markers passing underneath the aircraft's nose. She was committed. There was no go-around option with a single failing engine and hydraulics at 32%. This was it. This was the moment where 3 weeks of training and 3 hours of crisis management converged into a single point of contact. 500 feet. The aircraft was rock solid now, holding altitude perfectly as it descended toward the concrete. Sarah could see the runway numbered 15 painted on the surface. She could see the individual landing zone markings. She could see the runway extending ahead of her, seemingly endless and absolutely real. The left engine temperature spiked suddenly to 887 degrees, the highest reading yet. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but her hands remained absolutely steady. She was past the point where fear could affect her flying. She was in the execution phase now, the part where training and will took over from conscious thought. 300 feet. The landing lights of the runway became distinct markers. The emergency vehicles below looked impossibly small despite how large they appeared in her forward vision. Sarah adjusted the descent rate by the tiniest amount, compensating for a slight wind shift. The aircraft responded perfectly. 200 feet. She could see the runway surface in perfect detail now, the paint on the concrete, the slight undulations in the asphalt, the heat shimmers rising from the sun-baked surface. This was reality crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. 150 feet. The aircraft was descending at the perfect angle, the descent rate stable, the airspeed exactly where it needed to be. Sarah's world had compressed down to the relationship between altitude and descent rate and ground distance. Everything else was gone. There was only this moment, this aircraft, this landing. 100 feet. Sarah could see the landing zone markers clearly now. The aircraft was lined up perfectly with the center line. The descent was controlled and stable. 75 feet. The runway was now absolutely enormous, filling her entire field of vision. Sarah felt the subtle shift in air as the aircraft transitioned from free air to ground effect, the thin layer of compressed air between the aircraft and the earth that would help cushion the landing. 50 feet. This was the point where human instinct often betrayed pilots. This was where the desire to land too soft, too perfectly, sometimes caused crews to balloon up or land hard. Sarah knew this. She'd studied the psychology of landing approaches for weeks. 30 feet. The aircraft was descending at the perfect rate. Sarah could see the paint on individual runway markings now. She was going to land this aircraft. 20 feet. Sarah's hands made the final minute correction. The nose of the F-16 came up just slightly, creating the optimal landing attitude. The main landing gear was now descending toward the concrete below. 10 feet. The runway was passing beneath her. The aircraft was perfectly configured. Everything was perfect. 5 feet. Sarah could hear the landing gear whining softly. The aircraft was seconds from contact. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances, the main landing gear touched the runway. The contact was so smooth that for a moment, Sarah wondered if the landing had actually happened. But then the nose gear settled gently, and the aircraft was rolling on the runway, alive and grounded and successfully landed. The left engine was still running, the aircraft was still under her control, and she was alive. For exactly 2 seconds, Sarah allowed herself to feel relief. Just 2 seconds. Then she was all business, deploying the landing flaps to increase drag, feathering the left engine to reduce vibration, checking that the nose wheel steering was responding. The runway stretched ahead, and Sarah had perhaps 8,000 feet of concrete to use for braking and deceleration. More than enough. She deployed the speed brakes and the aircraft began to slow. The vibration from the damaged engine was still there, but it didn't matter anymore. She was on the ground. She had landed the aircraft successfully. Nothing else mattered. Sarah rolled the F-16 to a stop at roughly the midpoint of the runway, carefully using directional control rather than heavy braking that might strain the compromised systems. The aircraft came to rest smoothly, positioning itself perfectly in the designated emergency landing zone. Then there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. The engines powered down, the instruments fell quiet, and Sarah sat in the cockpit of her aircraft as a pilot who had just accomplished what should have been impossible. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the emergency vehicles began to move, rushing toward the F-16 from multiple directions. Fire trucks with their lights flashing, ambulances pulling into position, emergency personnel jumping from vehicles with practiced efficiency. Sarah popped the canopy and felt the desert heat rush in, mixing with the cool air of the cockpit. She unbuckled her harness with shaking hands and climbed from the aircraft on legs that didn't feel quite like her own. By the time her feet touched the ground, emergency medical personnel were there, checking her over, asking if she was injured. Sarah shook her head, barely hearing them. She was still in the cockpit mentally, still processing the landing, still not quite believing she'd made it. It took 15 minutes for the emergency response to transition from crisis mode to celebration mode. Sarah was directed away from the aircraft, cleared by medical personnel, and escorted toward the hangar. And that's when she saw them. The pilots were coming across the tarmac, all of them. Every pilot at Edwards Air Force Base was converging on the runway, walking toward her and her aircraft like mourners approaching a grave. But their expressions weren't mournful. They were transformed. Thompson reached her first. He stopped in front of her, his weathered face displaying emotions Sarah had never seen from him, something like awe, something like shame, something like genuine respect. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her, studying her face like he was seeing her for the first time. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Captain, I was deeply, profoundly wrong about you." He extended his hand, and Sarah took it. His grip was firm, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Behind him, Denver nodded. Harrison stepped forward to extend his hand. One by one, the pilots approached Sarah, each acknowledging her accomplishment, each offering congratulations that felt earned and genuine. The mockery was over, the tests were finished. Sarah Mitchell had landed a single-engine F-16 with catastrophic damage and emerged not just alive, but transformed. She was no longer the woman they had laughed at. She was Falcon, not as a joke, but as a title of achievement. Around them, the ground crew was gathering, the mechanics and fuel specialists and maintenance officers who had worked on the aircraft. Word had spread. Everyone wanted to see the pilot who had done the impossible. Sarah stood at the center of this growing crowd, still in her flight suit, still covered in the sweat of crisis, and allowed herself to smile. She had done it. Not just survived, but proven, absolutely and undeniably, that she belonged in the sky. The auditorium at Edwards Air Force Base was packed with military personnel in dress uniforms, blue fabric creating a sea of authority and tradition. Sarah sat in the front row, her own dress uniform immaculate, her expression carefully neutral despite the flutter of emotion in her chest. On the stage behind the podium stood General Marcus Williams, the same commanding officer who'd announced her call sign 6 months earlier, and next to him stood Colonel Thompson, now working in a supportive capacity rather than as her superior competitor. General Williams was speaking, his voice carrying through the auditorium with that particular military authority that made everyone sit straighter. "Today we honor exceptional service and extraordinary courage. On a day when circumstances aligned against survival, when systems failed and options disappeared, one pilot chose to fight. One pilot chose to fly with precision and discipline when everything suggested abandonment was the appropriate response. Today, we recognize that pilot." Sarah listened as he recounted the events of that Tuesday morning 6 months ago. The engine failure at 27,500 feet, the catastrophic system failures, the impossible descent, the perfect landing. But as he spoke, Sarah realized he was telling it differently than the newspapers had. He wasn't sensationalizing it. He was presenting it as a moment where training met crisis and created something transcendent. Captain Sarah Mitchell has been selected to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross, Williams continued. This award recognizes heroism and extraordinary achievement in flight. But beyond the medal, beyond the official recognition, what we truly honor today is what this moment represented. It represented a pilot who had trained relentlessly, who had prepared with meticulous dedication, who had refused to accept the limitations others placed on her. That is the standard we should all aspire to. Sarah stood as her name was called, walking across the stage in slow, measured steps. The auditorium erupted in applause, genuine, sustained applause that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Williams shook her hand, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: pride. Not the pride of a commander watching a subordinate follow orders, but the pride of someone who had witnessed greatness and wanted to acknowledge it. As she descended the stage, Sarah caught sight of Thompson in the audience. He was clapping along with everyone else, and when their eyes met, he nodded, a single, definitive gesture of respect. But the medal and the ceremony, as significant as they were, paled in comparison to what happened in the months that followed. The story had spread beyond the military. News outlets across the country had picked it up: the woman pilot who refused to eject, who brought down a single-engine fighter jet with catastrophic damage, who had transformed a potential tragedy into a triumph of human skill and determination. Sarah found herself giving interviews, speaking to aviation groups, becoming a face of what was possible when gender barriers collided with individual excellence. The impact was immediate and measurable. Applications to pilot training programs across the United States increased by 47% in the 6 months following the landing. Women represented 22% of new applicants, a historic high. But more significant than the numbers was the shift in perception. Women weren't just being tolerated in aviation anymore. They were being actively recruited, actively encouraged, actively imagined as legitimate pilots rather than curiosities. 3 months after the landing, Sarah was promoted to major. The promotion itself was routine, based on her record and service time, but the timing was symbolic. She was now a ranking officer, someone with authority not just in the cockpit but in the organizational structure of the military. She could make decisions that affected policy, training methodology, and personnel assignments. And that's when she made the move that would define her legacy beyond any single flight. She volunteered to become a flight instructor. The Flight Training Academy at Edwards had never had a female instructor before. Some of the older pilots questioned whether Sarah should be wasting her talents on training when she was qualified for advanced combat positions. But Sarah had seen something in the faces of the young women who'd started applying to the program after her landing. She'd seen herself, that desperate hunger to belong, to prove something, to fly. She began teaching in October of that year, and by that first winter, her classes had become the most sought after in the entire academy. Young pilots, men and women, lined up to study with her. She taught with the same meticulous precision she'd brought to her own flying, demanding perfection, while acknowledging the human factors that made perfection difficult. She told her students about the 3 weeks of obsessive training that had prepared her for crisis. She talked honestly about the doubt, the fear, the overwhelming pressure of not being accepted. But mostly, she taught flying. She taught her students that gender was irrelevant to the aircraft. The F-16 didn't care if you were male or female. The laws of aerodynamics didn't discriminate. The only thing that mattered was skill, dedication, and the willingness to push yourself past your perceived limits. One evening, 2 years after the landing, Sarah was walking through the Flight Operations building when she encountered a young woman, probably 24 or 25 years old, standing at the Ready Room bulletin board, staring at a photograph. "That's you, isn't it?" the woman said without turning around. "The Falcon landing." Sarah recognized the photograph immediately. It had become iconic, an F-16 touching down on one engine, silhouetted against golden sunlight, captured by a photographer standing exactly in the right place at exactly the right moment. "It is," Sarah confirmed. The young woman turned to face her. Her name tag read Martinez, and her eyes held something that Sarah recognized immediately. The same desperate determination that had driven Sarah herself 6 months before the landing. "I applied to the academy because of you," Martinez said quietly. "I was studying engineering. I was going to be an aircraft mechanic. But then I heard about what you did and I realized I could fly instead of just working on aircraft. You changed my trajectory." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This was the real legacy, not the medal, not the promotion, this. "You're going to do great things," Sarah told her. "I want to be half as good as you," Martinez replied. "Then aim higher," Sarah said. "Aim to be better than me, that's how progress works." By the time Sarah had been an instructor for 3 years, her classroom had produced some of the finest pilots Edwards had ever trained. And more significantly, women now comprised 31% of the Flight Academy's student body. The shift was becoming institutional, becoming normal, becoming unavoidable. One morning, Sarah was walking past the ready room and stopped at the sight that greeted her. Hung on the wall, framed in an ornate frame that suggested it was considered important, was the photograph of her landing. Beneath it was a single word printed in large letters: Falcon. Below that, someone had added a caption in careful handwriting: "Not a joke, a legend." Sarah stood before the photograph for a long time. The woman in that landing image was someone different, someone from a world where she had to prove herself again and again, where doubt was constant, where respect had to be earned through impossible feats. But she also recognized that woman. That was the moment she'd stopped needing external validation and started flying for the pure love of flying. The photograph had become more than documentation of a flight. It had become a symbol. Young pilots, especially young women, would pause before that image before heading out to the flight line. They would look at Falcon, and they would remember that the impossible could be made possible through preparation and determination, and an absolute refusal to quit. That evening, Sarah sat in her office at the academy, looking over the applications for the next semester's incoming class. 42% of the applicants were women. In the space of a few years, the entire culture had shifted. Not because of policy changes, though those had come. Not because of mandates from above. But because one pilot had shown it was possible. Sarah pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began writing personal notes to several applicants. Words of encouragement, advice about preparation, reminders that excellence didn't require being perfect, just persistent. She was no longer flying combat missions. She was no longer setting altitude records or breaking speed barriers. But in some ways, Sarah realized, this was the most important flying she'd ever do. She was teaching others to soar, showing them that the sky had no gender restrictions, that the only limits were the ones they accepted. Outside her office window, F-16 sat on the tarmac in the fading light of late afternoon. Somewhere on that flight line, young pilots were preparing for tomorrow's flights, training for futures that Sarah had helped make possible. The landing on that Tuesday morning 6 months ago had been the moment of individual triumph. But this, teaching, mentoring, opening doors, changing culture, this was where the real victory lived. This was the legacy of Falcon.